Have you ever wondered what happened to the Jews who managed to survive the Holocaust? They escaped the concentration camps. But the tragedy didn't end there. Europe rejected them, the hatred persisted, and the pain was just beginning. Today, we are going to tell you the story that no one taught you in school. The story of those who survived, but could never return home. Before we begin, please be advised that this content is strictly for educational and informational purposes. Our aim is to present this historical narrative with the utmost respect and accuracy, honoring the gravity of the events and the memory of all victims. When Allied armies crossed the borders of the Third Reich in 1945, they were not prepared for what they were about to discover. The Nazi concentration and extermination camps revealed to the world one of the greatest atrocities in human history. Bodies piled like refuse, living skeletons barely able to stand, nameless children, lost gazes, and the overwhelming silence of horror. Auschwitz, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, names that would become synonymous with absolute evil. More than 6 million European Jews were murdered by the Nazi regime. But what very few know is the story of those who survived. Because for the Jews who managed to emerge alive from the Holocaust, liberation did not mean the end of their suffering. On the contrary, it was the beginning of a new and painful struggle. Many were sick, malnourished, without family, without a homeland, without a place to return to. Europe was devastated by the war. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Millions of displaced people wandered aimlessly, and the Holocaust survivors found themselves in the middle of that chaos, completely alone. The Allies, aware of this tragedy, set up more than 700 displaced persons, DP camps in Germany, Austria, and Italy. There, hundreds of thousands of people, including more than 250,000 Jews, attempted, with what little they had left, to rebuild their lives. But it was not easy. The camps were saturated, resources were scarce, and uncertainty was total. The survivors suffered not only from the physical scars of years of torture, starvation, and disease, but also from the emotional void of having lost their families, their friends, and their identity. Returning home, for many, was impossible. When some Jews returned to their native towns, they encountered a terrifying reality. Their homes were occupied, their businesses were expropriated, and their neighbors looked at them with suspicion, or worse, with hatred. Anti-Semitism had not disappeared with Hitler's defeat. It remained alive, disguised as resentment, fear, or ambition. In Poland, for example, the Kielce pogrom in 1946 made it clear that hatred was still latent. An enraged mob murdered 42 Jews, many of them recently released from concentration camps, simply for trying to reclaim what was theirs. This and other episodes convinced thousands of Jews that Europe would no longer be their home. Many chose to emigrate, but the doors of the world were not open. The United States, Canada, and even some Latin American countries maintained strict immigration quotas. And so, for the majority, only one option remained: Palestine, under British mandate. Since 1920, Palestine was presented as the promised land. But getting there was not easy. The British, pressured by conflicts between Jews and Arabs in the region, had limited Jewish immigration to just 75,000 people over 5 years. An insignificant number compared to the millions of refugees and survivors. It was then that clandestine networks emerged, such as the Brecha, which means flight in Hebrew. These movements organized the illegal transfer of Jews from Europe to the Mediterranean ports, and from there, in dilapidated and overcrowded ships, towards Palestine. Between 1945 and 1948, more than 250,000 Jews attempted to reach that land. One of the best-known episodes was that of the ship Exodus 1947, which transported over 4,500 survivors. Upon reaching the coasts of Palestine, they were violently intercepted by the British and, in an act that outraged the world, sent back to Germany. The images of those men, women, and children who had escaped death in the extermination camps being returned to German soil generated a wave of international condemnation. The pressure grew, and in 1947, the UN proposed a partition plan that divided Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. Jewish leaders accepted. The Arabs rejected it. And so, on May 14, 1948, the birth of the State of Israel was proclaimed. For the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, Israel meant much more than a new country. It was an act of historical justice. It was recovering the right to exist, to defend themselves, to have a homeland of their own. Thousands emigrated, many still with the fresh wounds of Nazi horror. In Israel, they integrated as best they could into a young, militarized society that was facing its own war of survival. The refugee camps emptied, but the emotional scars remained. In Europe, meanwhile, another front was opening: the fight for the restitution of assets and for memory. The Holocaust was not only a genocide, it was also a massive plunder. Properties, businesses, works of art, personal objects. Everything was expropriated by the Nazis and, in many cases, by ordinary citizens. In 1952, West Germany signed a reparations agreement with Israel and Jewish organizations. They committed to paying financial compensation, but for many, money could never repair the human loss. Property restitutions were even more complex. In Eastern Europe, under communist regimes, claims were practically impossible. In other countries, the process was slow, unequal, and plagued with obstacles. Meanwhile, the survivors continued to fight, not just for material things, but to be heard, to be remembered. In 1953, Israel founded Yad Vashem, the great memorial dedicated to the victims of the Holocaust. It is not only a museum, but a center for documentation, research, and homage to the 6 million murdered Jews. In Europe, many of the former concentration and extermination camps were preserved as sites of memory: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek. Places where the silence speaks for itself. Monuments also emerged, such as the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, or initiatives like the Stolperstein, Stumbling Stones, small golden plaques on the streets that commemorate the victims at the doors of their former homes. But the fight for memory has not been easy. It faces denial, revisionism, and the anti-Semitism that still persists in many corners of the world. For this reason, the survivors became essential witnesses. Their stories, their testimonies, their gazes are the living proof that the Holocaust existed and that it must not be repeated. Today, most of them are elderly. Their voices are fading, but their history remains. The Holocaust did not end in 1945. For those who survived, the struggle continued in every refugee camp, in every attempt to reclaim a home, in every battle to rebuild their identity. The existence of the State of Israel, the memorials, the trials, the museums, are part of that resistance. To remember is not just an act of memory, it is an act of justice. It is the way the world commits itself to ensuring that hatred, intolerance, and barbarism never again become state policy. Because even among the ruins, even in the midst of the most absolute horror, human dignity can survive. And that is the story of the Jews who managed to emerge alive from the Holocaust. They survived hell, but their true challenge was just beginning.